Remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more of the best Reddit stories.
Teachers, what's the darkest thing you've seen from a student? Had a student in my class as a sophomore. Every morning her junior year she would come in and chat in the morning. One day out of the blue it stopped. In fact, she wasn't at school at all anymore. Fast forward 3 months, she shows up and looks broken. I ask her what's going on. After quite a bit of hesitation, she tells me that she went to a party and was DD. No alcohol in her system. However, she woke up the next morning and couldn't remember a thing about the previous night. A couple weeks later, she finds out she is pregnant. She was a virgin before that night. Roofied and raped. She had only told her counselor and now me. I haven't had a chance to talk to her due to COVID. Her outlook and demeanor was night and day before and after that party. This breaks my heart. I hope whoever was involved end up in prison. A student during holiday break a few years back murdered her mother and her mother's boyfriend brutally with the help of her own boyfriend. Then the bodies laid in the apartment as she left and eventually went to a New Year's party days later. Eventually she was arrested along with her boyfriend. Chilling to think she was sitting in my classroom days before, probably with this whole plan in her head. Student would hide in the bushes trying to get near female teacher's feet. Had to advise staff to wear closed-toe sandals, shoes because he was so interested. Discovered he was drawing women with their feet cut off as well as drawing severed feet in high heels. Out of curiosity, how old was this guy? 13. I was working at an after-school program as a director, site manager, and one of my employees radioed me needing my immediate assistance at the playground. I raced out there. The employees pulled me aside and said that I needed to look at Lil Billy's back since it was dark outside. She couldn't tell if it was scratch marks or burns. She said she had put in time out, standing against the basketball pole, and he was trying to lean up against it but kept making weird spastic moves every time he leaned against it, so she asked to look at his back after he said it hurt. I asked Lil Billy to follow me to the nurse's office, leaving the door open. The school staff was all gone, but there are cameras everywhere, and just in case, I didn't want anyone thinking I was doing something inappropriate with the kid since I had no idea what I was about to see and or hear. It took everything in my power to not audibly gasp once I lifted the back of his shirt. I counted at least 7 belt loop bruises and 5 lash marks. I asked where he got them from, to which he replied, "My dad. I got a bad grade. This kid got beat with both ends of a belt because he got a P in conduct." I ended up asking his permission to take pictures and I immediately called CPS. When I showed up to work the next day at 2 p.m., city and the ISD police were there. I found out, from the CPS person, that the woman listed as his mom was the dad's GF and she knew the beatings were going on and that this apparently wasn't the first time. CPS and the city police refused to let the GF or dad see him. Good. Mom lived in a neighboring town, so they removed him immediately and sent him there. That's the last I heard of anything. Not a teacher, but I worked with students. A student was forced to give oral sex in a vehicle while a screwdriver was held to her neck. When he orgasmed, she made a run for it back to her residence. She had the clarity and ingenuity to keep the semen in her mouth and spit it in a cup for evidence. There was a manhunt and the guy was caught. He was convicted of 3 separate student sexual assaults across the state. I was in the emergency room with the student a couple hours after the incident. Standing there as she described what happened, through her tears and in front of her mother, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to witness. I feel really bad for her and wish people never had to go through that, but her spitting in a cup was a really good idea, especially in that traumatizing of a situation. Thinking of something like that is impressive. I'm not a teacher, but I had an off hour in high school and I usually would use it for going home or just hanging out. I was asked by my film photography teacher if I could help with teaching by showing some of my examples and helping mostly 9th graders. I was in 11th grade at the time. I noticed one kid was really quiet and socially awkward, but he had really good prints. And after a couple days I noticed a lot of film was missing, and so I asked my teacher. He said that the quiet kid paid for some extra film to take home and use. I brushed it off for a while until it came to show some of the prints to the class. The quiet kid was third up and I was over near his desk and I noticed some of the pictures he printed. It was two people who turned out to be his mother and father on the floor with what I can assume a large quantity of Drew Gus and alcohol. Most of the photos were of his living situation. It was one of the saddest things I've seen. He was a bright and happy person. I got in contact with him a couple months ago and he's living with his grandparents after his mom and dad got into a fight of money. He now shoots a lot of nature photography. I didn't see it, but I heard it. I used to work at a shelter for at-risk girls aged 8 to 18, mainly truancy or runaway cases, but some were taken from homes of abuse, drugs, sex trafficking, etc. We housed and looked after roughly 20 girls at a time when we were at full capacity. Many of them had a lot of mental and emotional issues. One of our youngest girls at the time, around age 9, was talking to an older girl, around 13. Teen was nonchalantly talking about how she was raped as a young girl before she came to the shelter. Next thing I knew, at least 10 other girls who had overheard the conversation started talking about how old they were when they were raped. Some rattled off multiple ages and times when it occurred. Just causally, it was chilling to hear so many young girls tell their tales. Speaking from experience, it's easier to repeat those stories as a narrator, instead of a participant. Disconnecting emotions during retells helps prevent any flashbacks from feeling the memory versus reciting the memory. Especially for young girls, since they usually have to repeat the stories over and over for the courts or the social workers or the therapists, so it just becomes this deadpan matter of fact tone. Still just awful that anyone ever has to go through this shit. Sexual predators that go after children should be put in jail or some kind of group house for life. Unfortunately, mine never even saw the inside of a jail cell. Thank you for your work with the Zay girls at that shelter. I can't imagine that was easy to see, hear, or handle day in and day out, but it's super important work. My mom was a school nurse and always came home with some crazy stories. One of the most blood-curdling things she has was a girl that was really into cutting to the point where she had a scar that covered the majority of the outside of her bicep. The girl one day decided that she hated her scar and wanted to get rid of it. At home, by herself, she decided she was going to get rid of them. In her bathroom, she took a knife to her arm, cutting a 4 inches by 6 inches piece of scar tissue that was just under an inch thick out of her arm. She then proceeded to stitch it up using a needle and thread and bandage it with gauze all by herself. She then woke up and went to school the next day so she could go to my mom's office and ask if it looked infected. It was. After scrolling through this thread barely blinking for close to an hour, this sheet made me stare into the distance. Not a teacher, but I did do a lot of volunteer work with little kids. One of the 5th grade boys was caught grabbing random girls and trying to pull them into the supply closet and try to kiss them. He was even caught trying to grab their butts or would out his hand on their seat as they started to sit down. When we finally got to talk to his parents, turned out his grandpa was teaching him the Zay things. The weirdest part was when we questioned the grandpa about it, his response was, "Who cares, they're just little girls. Grandpa's a piece of shit." I was a sub for a while several years ago. I did the special education classes mostly, everything from kids who simply had a learning disability to students with severe disabilities such as ASD and behavioral issues. One kid had a very low IQ, and suffered from ADHD. He would come in every day an absolute mess. He was beyond violent and had zero control over his emotions. It's common to see those sorts of issues in some of the Zay kiddos, but we didn't understand why it was this bad. He had medication prescribed and on file to help with some of his issues. Well, come to find out, Mom had been keeping his medication to do only God knows what with. He wasn't getting anything to help with the Zay very real problems. Eventually this kid lost his sheet on the teacher's aide in the class and the school had to expel him. One class one was in a lot had mostly kids with ADHD, dyslexia, mild behavioral issues, and I really connected with them. It was a challenge, but I loved them. There was a boy, maybe 10 years old, who would talk to me quite a bit about his father who was in a local rehab program for meth abuse. It was a religious thing that kept people on a campus and had them do church stuff, labor, and volunteer work. Anyway, he would give me updates every few weeks. At the end of the year he comes up and says, "Guess what, Ms. Phoenix_0113. I think my dad is gonna come home. He says he's not gonna do Drew Gus anymore and he's done at rehab. I can't wait for him to come home. He went on about how they were gonna do father-son type things. It was heartbreaking to watch a child deal with a parent in rehab for meth. He was so hopeful and there was a deep love there. I hope sincerely, every time I think of that sweet kid, his dad is healthy and present for his son. I taught welding and metal sculpture at the high school level for a year. One morning, one of my students, a quiet, awkward, but really nice young man, came into class and asked me for a Band-Aid. I asked him what for and he replied that it was for a burn. Class hadn't started yet for the day. He showed me and it was a fresh second-degree burn that was already blistering. It was in the shape of an A. Some kids, if I'm going to be honest, they were bottom performers and troublemakers, from a different class of mine had swiped a small metal letter A from one of my supply bins, heated it with a lighter, and then branded this kid on the morning school bus. He had let the kids do it because he really wanted to fit in. He didn't have many friends and the Z kids had seemed cool because they were always acting out. As a mandatory reporter, I reported it. The police got involved. Other than that, I have no idea what else happened. Jesus, that poor kid. The worst thing is the kid did not realize until I explained to him that he will have that scar for the rest of his life. He got really quiet when I showed him the welding scars on my arms. Had a kindergartner smash a glass measuring cup and stab himself in the arm to the point that blood was everywhere, all while repeatedly crying, "Please just let me die, I just want to die." Had to sit in my car and cry for about 30 minutes before driving home that day. JFC. Was that child okay in the end? A kindergartner, just, what has he seen? My God. We ended up getting him enrolled in a full-day hospitalization program that combined therapy and schooling. I've heard great things about it, but his family moved to another city the following year. I think about him often. I really hope he got some help because he was a charming and intelligent child but was very troubled. Am a teacher. A student saw one of my former co-teachers at some point with his wife and thought she was hot, and my co-teacher took advantage of this to get the student to secretly record his sister taking showers and shit. He offered videos of his wife performing sexual acts with him to the student in exchange. He finally got caught when the student blackmailed the teacher into trying to get the wife to duck him, and when he proposed it to his wife, she called the cops. I substituted at a school for kids with intellectual disabilities and emotional disorders for a while. Majority of the kids had autism to varying degrees. The darker stuff didn't come from the students so much as faculty gossiping about what the students' home lives were like, but from the kids themselves. In one class with more verbal and well-behaved students, occasionally one would, for instance, get frustrated with a problem, start yelling, "None of this shit matters," followed by what I would call quasi-suicidal, existential ideation. It would kind of set off a chain reaction in the class where other students would sort of rally along in agreement. "Oh shit, it's happening," in the replies. All over the world people are screaming out that the kid got a point.